Carrie, the teen librarian, back again for another First Chapter Friday. I don't know if I've mentioned before in this particular format, but I'm a bit of an unrepentant, unashamed fangirl geek. Movies, fandoms, TV shows, watching in binge, the occasional fanfic or fan art I will not turn my nose up at, and so this week I thought I'd indulge that craving for fandom content with a little Loki. I don't know if you watched it yet. If you have, we've probably passed the point where we have to avoid spoilers for those who haven't finished watching it, but that doesn't matter because this particular take on Loki is by Mackenzi Lee, another author who I love what she's written. Doesn't focus on the Loki of now, really doesn't focus on the Loki of the future. It focuses on young Loki, way back before any of the stuff from the Avenger movies happened. And it's just a fun look at what Miss Lee imagines might have been. It focuses on when he and Thor were sort of, I don't know, they're still, gods of Asgard, but they're more teenage gods, shall we put it. And Loki's relationship with another person named Amora, who lives in Asgard, but they're both inclined toward mischief, shall we say, and then there are consequences to that mischief that result in the friendship being prematurely ended as they're separated. But then they come back together in another location for a whole lot more craziness. I think you'll like it. I hope you'll like it. So, I give you Loki, Where Mischief Lies by Mackenzi Lee. Part 1, Chapter 1. The royal feast of Gullveig, like all Asgardian feast days, was enjoyable for those who were fond of listening to overly long speeches, exchanging inane niceties, and getting their feet stepped on, because the Great Hall was always too crowded, and no one knew how to walk in heels. Loki was convinced everyone loathed the feasts, but no one dared say so, for fear of appearing small-minded. Being quite confident of the size of his mind, large, and his ability to walk in heels, he was comfortable saying it. I hate feast days. In the royal receiving line beside him, Thor didn't drop the politician's smile he'd been practicing for state occasions like this. It had only faltered when Loki had suggested showing that much teeth made it very obvious there was something stuck in them, and he'd fumbled with his tongue for several minutes, lips bulging in a grotesque way that made several approaching courtiers change course before realizing there was nothing there. The feasts are important days, Thor said. They instill competence in Asgard's leaders among our court. Confidence, Loki corrected. The smile didn't slip, but Thor's eyebrows crept together. What? I memorized the same quote, Loki replied. It's confidence. What did I say? Never mind. Loki fixed his own overly large smile, raising his voice so Thor could hear him over the musicians playing a lively folk song. You did it perfectly. Thor adjusted the circlet resting on his forehead. Beads of sweat were beginning to gather around it, and it was slipping over his brows. Loki had been offered a circlet as well. His mother had selected a silver braid inlaid with small gemstones for him. But while Loki loved few things as much as a bit of sparkle, he had opted instead for a more sophisticated, understated look that the circlet would have ruined entirely. He didn't have to enjoy feast days, but he could look good for them. The boots made him feel like doing a strut down the middle of the hall, black over the knee, and with heels as long and thin as the knives he kept up his sleeves. His coat had a high collar and green ribbing on the shoulders, and he wore loose trousers of the same color. Amora had told him green made his eyes look like jewels, but he'd been careful not to wear it too often. Best not to let Amora think he was taking her advice too seriously. She might have always been right, but she didn't have to know that. Loki glanced down the line of dignitaries, past Thor and Frigga in her flowing silver robes, hands tucked beneath the sleeves as she smiled and nodded to the Asgardian woman fumbling a compliment about how lovely the queen's hair looked with its streaks of gray. On her other side were the ambassadors from Varenheim and Ringsfjord, talking with their heads bent toward Queen Jolena, who kept asking loudly if they could speak up. Past them, Karnilla, the Queen of Norns, and Odin's royal sorceress, stood like a soldier, the plaits of her dark hair wound together and wrapped around a gold headpiece with a purple stone set upon her brow. Her face was blank. In the time she'd been at court, Loki had never seen her wear any expression beyond a dutiful grimace of acknowledgement. One of her long-fingered hands rested on Amora's shoulder, like she was certain her apprentice would slip away if a hold wasn't kept on her. It wasn't outside the realm of possibility. Amora was looking far more obviously bored than Loki felt she should. far more bored than he was sure he could get away with without a lecture from his father. She may get one from Carnilla too, but Amora seemed to care so much less about what her teacher thought than Loki did about Odin's opinions. He wished he could afford not to care, not to feel like everything he did right or wrong was ticked off in a corresponding column and kept on file for the day Odin would name either him or Thor as heir to the Asgardian crown. It would be so much easier if there were only one of him. Amora was the only student Carnilla had ever taken on, and the only magic wielder in Asgard powerful enough to take up the mantle of royal sorceress and queen of the Norns. Amora's power made her desired. Loki's power made him feel the need to keep it hidden. No one wanted a sorcerer for a king. The kings of Asgard were warriors. They wore their golden hair long and their armor polished and their scars from battle casually on display like ostentatious accessories. Oh, this old thing? Merely a token from a rogue Sakaran who was foolish enough to test his strength against mine. Amora managed to wriggle away from Carnilla's side long enough to snatch a goblet off the tray of a passing kitchen servant, and Loki watched as she touched one finger to the surface and levitated a small drop from it. It hung in midair, a few inches from her palm, until Carnilla reached over without looking and clamped a hand over Amora's, quashing the spell. Amora rolled her eyes then, perhaps sensing the inappropriate duration of Loki's gaze, glanced around. She caught his eye and offered her a crooked finger of a smile. Loki felt his ears go red, and he almost looked away, like that would negate the fact that she'd caught him staring. Instead, he offered her an exasperated eye widening, to which she responded by pantomiming hanging herself. He snorted. Thor frowned at him, then followed his gaze, but Amora had straightened herself out again, smiling alongside Carnilla at the courtier who had come to speak to them. She seemed to be putting a great deal of effort into making her smile look as forced as possible, as much as Thor had been putting into making his look sincere. But she was smiling, so no one could accuse her of a contrary disposition. Thor's frown went deeper, burying his circlet further into his brow, and he pushed it up before turning forward with a huff that sounded like an imitation of their father. When Loki caught Amora's eye again, she made a subtle gesture down at the tiles and raised her eyebrows. Loki hesitated. Carrying out the small spells she taught him at dinner or in their classroom was one thing, but doing it as state function was quite another. It would be harmless. Turning the tiles of the Great Hall pink had been his idea, after all, but he had suggested it half in jest, hoping he would impress her with the boldness of the idea and creative use of the spell weaving without actually having to execute it. But Amora had to see everything through to the end. Everything that could be tried had to be, no matter the consequences. And there were always consequences, whether a whack on the back of a head from a wearied tutor or a private summons to Carnilla's chambers. Amora did it all anyway. Loki felt the burnt jealousy at her fearlessness, the way she didn't seem to feel any shame when Odin or Carnilla scolded her. His own heart always twisted, no matter how high he raised his chin in defiance, no matter how blameless he thought himself. Once, as a boy, Loki had used his magic to extinguish all the lights in the palace simultaneously. He was baffled when Odin had not been delighted and proud as he had expected, but rather so enraged Loki had feared his father might strike him. Instead, Loki was sent to his chambers to sit in isolation, wriggling with a shame he didn't understand, before his mother finally came and explained that it would be best if he didn't use the magic he could feel vibrating through his bones, but instead dedicated himself to becoming a warrior like his brother. It would be best, she had said, for his future. She had spoken gently. It was the only way his mother ever spoke. But the humiliation of that moment had never managed to detach itself from every spell he cast. Though he had done very little spellcasting, until Amora arrived in court. He had tried to make himself a warrior, tried to run faster and train harder, learned to take a blow without buckling, all the things Thor seemed to do without trying, the skills they had been told were most becoming of a future king of Asgard, while Loki's only skill seemed to be turning the mead in his brother's goblet into slugs once he began to drink, and then back into wine when he spat it out. It wasn't the best strategy for dealing with emotions, but it was his strategy. The slug trick was what had first caught Amora's attention. When Thor had sputtered his mead across the table, Odin had berated him for his poor manners in front of their guests, the Norn Queen, Carnilla, and her apprentice, Amora, on their first night in the Asgardian palace. As Thor had insisted over and over that there were slugs, there had been slugs, he was certain there had been slugs, Loki's gaze had drifted across the table to Amora without knowing why, only to find she was already watching him. The corners of her mouth had turned up around her fork. But then she looked away, and he had gone back to staring at his stew. He had told himself the slugs were to get his brother back for knocking him flat in the sparring ring that morning, in spite of promising not to. A promise that had been quickly forgotten once he realized Sif was watching. It wasn't because Amora was a magician, the first other magic wielder he'd ever met besides his mother, whose uses of magic were always small and controlled. Tea party magic, as Loki had begun to think of it. Frigga had always worked to keep her powers out of sight, and encouraged Loki to do the same. But Amora was allowed to wear her powers on her sleeve, and flaunt them as part of her training for her future position in court. It wasn't because her long hair was the color of honey, and she wore it wrapped around her head in an endless loop that looked like snakes winding together. It wasn't because of those slanted features or that crooked smile. What did you expect? He chided himself as he poked at a chunk of meat, watching it bounce back to the thick, oily surface. For her to be thrilled about finding another magic wielder in Asgard? A magician who had never been taught to control his powers, which meant they usually escaped in inelegant, clumsy stunts he was struggling to teach himself? The slugs had been good, though. His gaze drifted again to Amora, but her dark eyes, black but for a few thin veins of emerald that forked through them like an acidic lightning storm, were on Karnilla. As she listened to Karnilla and Odin discuss the upcoming tutelage Amora would be given at court before the feast of Gulveig, and how it would prepare her for her future role as right hand to one of Odin's sons, Loki felt small and strange again, not worthy of notice by someone he had thought might resemble himself. But at the end of the meal, when he finished his wine, he'd found a small snail in the bottom, writhing lethargically in the dregs. He'd looked up, but Amara was already gone, leaving him with that single disgusting calling card. The slug trick is clever, she told him later, when he found her in the palace library, curled into the bench of one of the circular windows that overlooked the gardens. She had a stack of books at her feet that he was certain she had selected only for the aesthetic effect. But what if you waited to change them until just as he was swallowing? It's far more horrifying to swallow a mouthful of slugs than to spit one out all over the table, don't you think? Loki hadn't thought of that. He also wasn't certain he had enough control of his own magical powers to time a spell so perfectly. When he didn't say anything, Amora's eyes flicked up from the page of the book she had opened on her lap, and he was certain that she knew how good aloofness looked on her. She had let her braids loose, and the tilt of her chin sent her hair cascading perfectly down her shoulders, like a carpet unfurled before the feet of a visiting king. "Who taught you how to do that?" she asked. "No one," he replied. He had honed any skills he had alone, making his grasp of his own powers rough and rudimentary and frustratingly tenuous. He could feel the well inside him, how deep and strong it ran, but could find no way to tap it. "I didn't know Odin's son was a sorcerer," she said. "There's a reason for that." He had wanted to sit beside her, but somehow that felt too presumptuous. A bold assumption that he was interesting enough for her to want around. Instead, he went for a casual lean against one of the shelves, which he realized mid-tilt was much further away than he had thought. Asgardians don't want their princes to be magicians. It's not the sort of power they value. Amora stared at him for a moment, then folded the corner of the page before shutting the book, a gesture that felt like such destruction in miniature that made Loki want to crease the pages of every book in his father's library. "Hasn't Odin hired someone to teach you?" she asked. "Or your mother? She's a sorceress." "No," he said, certain he sank a few inches deeper into the carpet. "I mean, yes, she is, but my father doesn't want me to study magic." "Because he's afraid of you." Loki laughed before he could stop himself at the thought of Odin, built like a boulder and with a rough, smashing demeanor to match, being frightened of his own son, particularly the smaller, skinnier one. "He's not afraid of me. He just wants me to be the best contender for the throne that I can be, so he has me trained with the soldiers." Now it was Amora's turn to laugh. "That's like keeping a warship in shallow waters. What a waste." She stroked the spine of the book, appraising him. She seemed to be made of smoke, the way her body spiraled and swooped with the shape of the windowsill. She had kicked off her shoes, and her bare toes curled against the stone. "You're not a soldier," she said. "You're a magician, and someone ought to teach you how to be one." "Someone ought to," he replied. She offered him a smile, one that felt like a dagger drawn slowly from its sheath, that dangerous hum of scraping metal in the moment of stillness that preluded a strike. Then she flipped open the book on her lap again, and his heart dropped, thinking he had been too opaque, too unreadable, too cold, all the things his brother wasn't, the things his tutors had told him not to be, the things the other trainers in the warrior camp had teased him for. But then she slung her feet off the seat beside her and said, "Are you going to sit down?" And he did. That had been months ago, months of which Loki and Amora had knit themselves into an inseparable duo that the servants whispered about and the courtiers disapproved of. Even now, in the great hall on a feast day, Loki felt their eyes glancing at him, trying to determine whether his partnership with Karnilla's headstrong apprentice had altered him in a way they could see. Above him, the candles in the boat-shaped chandeliers that lined the great hall flickered, their lights dancing along the golden leaf that blanketed the wainscoting. The shape of the ceilings had always reminded him of the inside of an instrument, bowed and curved in places, designed to amplify sound and make every gathering feel bigger and more impressive. Loki peeked down at the tiles underneath his feet, black with streaks of gold shooting through them, carving out the elaborate intricate roots that joined to form Yggdrasil at the base of the grand stairway. When he met Amora's gaze again, she did an exaggerated eye flash flutter and pressed her hands together in pleading, and he knew he would set the hall on fire and then run naked through it if she asked. "What are you plotting?" Thor muttered beside him. "Plotting?" Loki repeated, pinning on his best smile to scare an approaching courtier away from them. "I never plot." Thor snorted. "Please." "Please what? Please plot?" Thor ground his foot into Loki's, and Loki bit his tongue to stifle a squeak of pain. Careful, I love these boots more than I love you. Thor glanced down the row again to where Amora had put on another exaggeratedly innocent face. Thor had not taken to her the way Loki had. He had joined them on a few escapades around the palace, but always with his feet dragging, checking over his shoulder to be certain they wouldn't be caught, and repeating, "I don't think we should be doing this," so often that Amora had suggested they start charging him for every repetition. Eventually he had stopped coming along, which suited Loki fine. He didn't want to share Amora with his brother. He didn't want to share her with anyone. She was all his in a way no one had ever been. No one had ever wanted to be. And it was nice to see Thor left out of conversations for once. Thor had never offered a direct opinion on Amora. No one had. They just whispered about her behind her back, the way everyone always had about Loki. Too unpredictable, too strong, shouldn't be allowed out of Nornheim, even if the king and his sorceress thought the structure and rigidity of the royal court would temper her strong will. Suddenly, 3 thundering booms cut through the chatter, ringing around the hall. The musicians silenced, and the courtiers hushed, rotating to the top of the grand stairway. Loki pivoted along with the rest of the royal officials in their receiving line, and turned his face upward to where Odin stood, dressed in his feast day robes of claret deep red, his spear, Gungnir, in his fist. His beard was woven with golden thread, and on his brow was a circlet in the same style as Thor's. Loki felt a twinge of regret. Perhaps he should have worn his after all, no matter that it clashed with the rest of his ensemble. "Asgardians!" Odin boomed, his voice echoing off the curved ceiling and carrying easily through the hall. "Friends, visitors, distinguished guests from across the 9 realms, you honor us with your presence at this, our holy feast of Gulveig." Loki had heard some variation on this speech at every feast day since he was a boy. It was remarkable how many heroic warriors Asgard had decided to commemorate with their own feast days, and while the food was always good, it was never worth having to stand in an awkward receiving line, getting pats on the head from courtiers, and then enduring his father's dull speech about whatever blonde man with rippling biceps and an insatiable thirst for blood of Asgardian enemies was being honored that particular day. But the Feast of Gulveig was different in one substantial way. "Today," Odin continued, touching one finger to the patch that covered his empty right eye socket as he looked around, "we celebrate the day of the warrior king who, 100 centuries ago, harnessed the rime flows of Niflheim in the siege of Muspelheim, and from it forged the God's Eye mirror. That same mirror has been brought up from the palace vault, and with the strength and power of our own royal sorceress from Nornheim, shall grant a vision of the decade to come, and the threats Asgard shall need to arm ourselves against. This is the way we keep our kingdom safe from threats across the 9 realms, and from Ragnarok itself. The God's Eye mirror gives no answers and no certainty. Its eye is open only for this one day each decade, but it is the visions it reveals that have helped keep Asgard fortified and strong for centuries. At the end of this feast day, I will confer with my generals and advisors, and we will devise the best strategies for the future prosperity of our people." Loki had learned all of this from his history teachers in preparation for the feast. The first in his memory that the God's Eye mirror had been brought out, and Karnilla had come to wield its powers. But he still pushed himself up on his toes for a better look as the curtain behind his father was drawn back by 2 Einherjar soldiers. The God's Eye mirror was a wall of shimmering black obsidian, a perfect square set in a thin gold frame with carved gold staves curling around each corner. He had seen it before, when Odin had taken both him and Thor down to the vault below the palace, and explained to them the power of each object kept there, and the lengths to which they had gone to keep his people safe from it. But here, away from the dark walls and dim light of the vault, and no longer surrounded by the host of artifacts Odin had captured to prevent the end of the world, it felt more imposing, more powerful. The mirror stood straight on its own, with no feet or supports. The already silent hall seemed to sink into an even more absolute stillness. Karnilla had ascended the stairs, and when Odin extended a hand to her, they walked together to the mirror. He took his place on one side, she on the other, her palms pressed flat against the surface. Odin handed Gungnir to one of the Einherjar, then turned to his people again, arms extended. "To another decade of peace and prosperity in our great realm." Loki felt something brush his elbow, and then Amora's voice was in his ear. "So do we change the tile now, while your father is occupied, or do we want to be certain everyone sees how poorly fuchsia clashes with his robes?" Loki's response was cut off by a crackle of energy from the top of the stairs. He felt the hairs on his neck rise, the air suddenly feeling hot, heavy, like the prelude to a lightning storm. A fork of white light erratically split the ceiling of the great hall. The assembled courtiers gasped, but from her spot across the mirror from Odin, Karnilla raised a hand, and the light flew to her fist, gathering around it in a cyclone. Loki felt his mouth hang open, marveling at the elegance, the control, the way the magic moved through the air and answered her call. He felt Amora poke him in the back. "Loki." Karnilla opened her hand and pressed it to the obsidian surface. The staves at each corner of the mirror glowed, the lines of each rune flaring so bright it seemed for a moment they might ignite. The surface rippled like a pond struck by a stone, and Odin's eye turned white, the images of Asgard's future flashing across the mirror's surface, unseen by anyone but him. "I have a feeling you're not listening to me," Amora said, this time her lips so close to Loki's ear that he felt her breath. "Quiet," Thor hissed at them from Loki's other side. Amora pivoted to him. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I interrupting something important?" Another crackle of lightning dancing across the ceiling flew to Carnilla's hand. "Show some respect," Thor hissed through his teeth. "Is something about my speaking disrespectful?" Amora replied. "Yes, the fact that you're speaking at all." Loki felt a sudden hand on his shoulder and turned as his mother stepped between him and Amora, her gaze still fixed on Odin at the top of the grand staircase, and her grip very gentle. "That's enough," she said quietly. Loki wanted to protest that he'd been the only one not speaking over this important ceremony, but Frigga squeezed his shoulders, and he swallowed his words. Another bolt of lightning leaped from Carnilla's hand to the surface of the mirror, but this one was different. Loki felt a change in the air, a shift in the magic that made him shudder. His mother must have felt it too, her hand spasmed on his shoulder. Odin took an abrupt step back from the mirror, one hand rising like he was trying to push something away. Then an audible cry escaped his lips. On the other side, Carnilla paused, hands still in the air with threads of white light whirring in a hive around it. Then Odin tore himself away from the mirror, breaking the spell. The magic drained from his eye, leaving behind his dark iris flooded with panic. He stumbled, catching himself on the rail. There was a gasp from the assembled court. One of the Einherjar reached out to Odin, but the king pushed him away, snatching back his staff and starting on the stairs at a tripping gait. He may have been trying to pull himself together, but he looked frayed. Carnilla let the spell die on her fingers, the light extinguished, before she stepped out from behind the mirror and started down the opposite side of the stairs after Odin. "Continue with the feast," Odin instructed the captain, standing in salute at the base of the stairs. "I'll return shortly." He paused, and his eyes swiveled, first to Thor, then to Loki, the gaze heavy and meaningful in a way that made Loki's skin crawl. Whatever vision his father had seen, Loki was suddenly certain, in a way he couldn't explain, that they had been a part of it. Odin ran a hand over his beard, then flicked his fingers at Frigga, motioning for her to follow. "My queen." Loki felt his mother's hand leave his shoulder as she followed Odin from the hall, Carnilla and his sentries on his heels. The doors of the great hall banged behind him, and noise flooded back into the room, this time panicked and anxious. On either side of Loki, Amora and Thor were silent, staring after Odin. All thoughts of pink tiles that shifted colors beneath the feet of the court evaporated. Instead, Loki felt a cold pit settle in his stomach that he couldn't explain or banish. He had never seen fear like that on his father's face. If it had even been fear, that look had been so foreign it was impossible to recognize. "What happened?" Thor asked at last. "I think the question is," Amora replied, "what did he see?" Hope you enjoyed that. First chapter of Loki, Where Mischief Lies, by Mackenzi Lee.